But first, I've been blown away this week by some of the stories highlighting incredible bravery in all its forms. Not just here in Australia, but globally. We were reminded of the heroics of our veterans. The last remaining New South Wales Rat of Tobruk, Ernie Wilson, passed away. His immense courage and integrity inspired a nation, equal parts stubborn, determined and utterly heroic. Ernie and his mates resisted a brutal and unrelenting enemy siege over 8 months in 1941, carving their slogan, "No surrender," into Australian history. A world away and several generations later, another form of courage is on display. I'm not just talking about the Ukrainians, whose battlefield bravery might be somewhat recognisable to the original Rats of Tobruk. No, these heroes aren't wearing uniforms, nor engaging a conventional enemy. I'm talking about the people of Iran and China currently protesting their own authoritarian regimes. It takes a unique brand of bravery to take to the streets of your own home country, defying the orders of a government with the record of the most horrendous crimes against its own people. With a moral compass you'd hate to need to rely on for your own life or the safety of those you love. The right to peacefully protest is an incredible thing and is something that we, by and large, enjoy in Australia and the Western world. And I say this with images in my head of idiots gluing themselves to high-end art. Doesn't really compare, does it? I often wonder how brave and willing those protesters might be if the consequences of their actions were a little more grave. Compare this to China, where for the first time since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, we are seeing the masses hit the streets in an incredible display of people power. Also, the first significant expression of internal dissatisfaction towards ruler Xi Jinping. Now, this isn't just about COVID lockdowns. This domestic tension has been building for years, decades in fact. After repeatedly and arrogantly batting away criticism on the global stage, it will be very interesting to see how the CCP continually deals with unrest in its own house. Yes, they've softened their approach to the pandemic over the past couple of days, but will that be enough? We all know momentum is hard to stop. Normally, one of the world's most effective at censorship, Vision, like you just saw, is leaking out and being blasted onto TV screens around the globe. Further east, scenes emerging out of Iran in recent weeks, months in fact, in a word, have been mind-blowing. The cry, "Woman, life, freedom," echoes through city streets. Many have already died, given their lives for a cause they deeply believe in. Yet still, they fight, unwilling to be bullied into submission. In a brutal tactic to discourage protesters, reports are now emerging that Iran's Revolutionary Guard are targeting the children of known dissidents, with many dozens murdered in recent weeks. It is so hard to comprehend. Firstly, how this can happen, and secondly, how these people can keep showing up. It takes unimaginable courage to continue under these circumstances. It also raises a question we tend to ask ourselves every time an oppressed people rise up and throw off, or seek to throw off, the shackles of dictatorship. Why now? In both these countries, human rights atrocities have occurred for decades. Iron-fisted rulers have squashed any prior hint of uprise so quickly and fiercely, it barely makes a splash. I asked myself the same question in the late 1990s as I watched this happen from my bedroom window in Jakarta, Indonesia. After 3 decades of corruption, nepotism and autonomous rule, the Indonesian people took to the streets, I remember it so vividly, and they demanded democracy. With the benefit of hindsight, the origins of this revolution are a little easier to pinpoint. The Asian financial crisis had started the year before, robbing the populace of its purchasing power, savings and livelihoods. Suharto's regime had always been heavy-handed with endemic corruption. But this was a price you paid for an economically stable nation. When that economic stability disappeared, people's willingness to look the other way did too. I still, as I said, so vividly remember as well the flashpoint in May 1998 when students at Trisakti University were gunned down in scenes reminiscent of the infamous shootings at Kent State University in 1970. Straight afterwards, I and the other non-essential, as they called us, embassy staff and their families were hastily evacuated back home to Australia. Sitting on the floor of the airport, waiting for our emergency flights, with television cameras filming us and the glow of a burning city in the distance, I didn't quite understand the enormity of what I was witnessing. But I knew enough, even at that young age, to realise it was something significant. And just a few days later, people power forced a dictator's resignation, and Indonesia took its first tentative steps towards democracy. Yes, a long and imperfect journey, but heading in the right direction all the same. I hold out hope, I really do, that the Iranian and Chinese protesters have similar success in effecting regime change. However, it would be naive to expect that this will happen easily, if unfortunately at all. Ironically, the more brutal a regime is, the longer it tends to last. The leaders of Iran and China are less likely to be affected by international condemnation. I mean, we're seeing that with Vladimir Putin at the moment. And more likely to employ brutal tactics to suppress any dissent. But everything has its limits. History shows us that you can only treat your people like mugs for so long. Dictators are much harder to take down, but eventually they fall. So what can we do, if anything? There's been international condemnation, including by many Australians, of the human rights abuses occurring around the world, but are words ever really enough? Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who spent 800 days behind bars in Iran, is calling on the Australian government to do more. She's baffled as to why they've been so weak, and so am I, to be honest. It is a no-brainer.
I really don't understand it, particularly given our quite strong support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. The Iranians are fighting for the exact same values that the Ukrainians are fighting for: democracy, freedom. And it's in Australia's manifest interest to remove this brutal dictatorship from the Middle East.
And she was speaking on my show on Sunday. The Labor Party must act strongly and swiftly, loaded with much more power and influence than you and I will ever have. But that doesn't mean that we are off the hook. We must all continue to use whatever means we have to help. If the protests continue but fade to the back pages of newspapers across the world, if our interest wanes, then nothing will change. But ultimately, it will all come down to the individual courage of those everyday people in China and Iran, and their willingness to dig in, stay the distance, and continue the fight. And whatever the outcome, I have no doubt that 80 years from now, we will speak of their bravery in the same revered tones as Ernie Wilson and his fighting rats.